Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, which features stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life story for present-day listeners and for the generations to come. Our entire collection is available at voicesofoklahoma.com. By subscribing to our podcast, you will be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. So now listen to another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
Group Hospital Services of Oklahoma, known as the Oklahoma Plan, opened its doors in the Tulsa Loan Building at 4th and Main on March 15, 1940. The plan would soon adopt the Blue Cross name and logo. The interest in prepaid hospital care had actually started in 1929, with a group of 1,500 school teachers in Dallas who contracted with Baylor Medical Center. These plans evolved as a result of the Depression. In 1939, Oklahoma doctors went to Dallas to investigate this new form of paying for healthcare costs. The state headquarters was established in Tulsa, since it was the first Oklahoma city to come up with $5,000 in seed money. By the end of 1949, Blue Cross of Oklahoma membership stood at 300,000 individuals, and Blue Shield membership had reached over 169,000. Now you are invited to listen to two former Blue Cross chief executive officers, Ralph Rhoades and Ron King, as they discuss the history and growth of Blue Cross Blue Shield on voicesofoklahoma.com.
Today's date is February 26, 2013. My name is John Erling, and we are here today to tell the story of Blue Cross and Blue Shield, how the concept began, and how and why it came to Oklahoma. Here to help tell the story are Ron King and Ralph Rhoades, the former presidents of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma. Ralph, for our oral history record, would you please state your full name?
My full name is Ralph Short Rhoades. Now, where did the short come from? Is my grandmother's maiden name.
Okay. And then your date of birth and present age.
My date of birth was 11/27/26. I was born in a farmhouse in eastern Colorado. I'm 86.
Tell us where we're recording this interview.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma's head office.
So you were born in Colorado, but let's jump ahead. What was your first connection to Blue Cross and Blue Shield? When did that moment come about?
I had a buddy. We went to TU, Tulsa University. I had a buddy who was working for Blue Cross and Blue Shield. I was doing a tryout at KTUL radio, and he called me one day and said, I'm going to leave this organization I'm with, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and you are the guy that I've picked to take my place. So that's how I came for an interview just out of the clear blue sky, because Jack Stewart said, go talk to him, which I did.
What was the job?
I'll tell you what I did first. I used the addressograph machine to send out a newsletter.
That was your first job?
Yeah. That was the beginning of the public relations department, which I then headed for 15 years.
You created the public relations department?
Yeah.
That would have been in what year?
1950.
So it was just on a whim. Somebody said, I have picked you.
Yes. We had been schoolmates out at Tulsa University. It's interesting about that guy who sent me to Blue Cross. They were then located in the basement of the Akdar Temple. Now, not many Tulsans remember the Akdar Temple. It's a parking lot now, but in that basement we had probably about 200 or 300 people. The claims department covered most of the floor space in that basement.
We're going to get into some of that. And also, of course, here is Ron King. So, Ron, would you state your full name, your date of birth, and your present age?
I'm Ronald Frank King. I was born February 14, 1948, so I'm now 65.
And where were you born?
I was born in Bartlesville, Oklahoma.
And raised then in that
Raised in
area?
Bartlesville, yeah.
What was your first connection to Blue Cross?
I came to work at Blue Cross on May 18th, 1980. At that time, Ralph, who was CEO, was searching for a planning and product development department head. And I was, at that time, working for Bank of Oklahoma. It just so happened that the search firm that Ralph was using back in those days was Arthur Young and Company. And they were doing a search for somebody to come in a vice president position here at Blue Cross. And I was coincidentally working with them at Bank of Oklahoma on an audit. So the guy that was working with me at the bank was working with Ralph at Blue Cross. on a separate assignment. Apparently they were going through a list of candidates, and he just asked me one afternoon, he said, why don't you put your name in the hat over at Blue Cross? At that time I wasn't really looking for a position, but I thought, well, why not? And after a series of 3 or 4 interviews with Ralph, I was hired as Vice President, Planning and Product Development.
All right. So you guys have history, don't you, together?
Yes, we do.
Yep.
You could tell stories that we can't even tell here, huh?
Well, we can tell most of them.
I'm sure you can. So, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, we will point out at the outset that they were developed separately, with Blue Cross providing coverage for hospital services and Blue Shield covered physician services. Let's go back to the beginning. Its predecessor was developed by Justin Ford Kimball in 1929. Ralph, you perhaps can tell us that story.
Well, that came about as a result of the school district in Dallas, Texas. The teachers need a way for them to go to the hospital. Kimball then set up a program where they could pay so much a month into a fund, and then they could go to a hospital and have their babies or have their appendix out or whatever happened to teachers in those days in 1929.
And we could point out, because we'll be talking about costs as we go along here, that the first plan guaranteed teachers 21 days of hospital care for $6 a year.
Yes, a year.
Yeah.
From there, however, Blue Cross started on the East Coast. It went from Dallas to Baltimore and Philadelphia up the East Coast, and then ended up, you need to know this story, because Andy Helen was the first president in Oklahoma. Andy Helen was from Minnesota and Wisconsin. He called himself the sweat socks salesman because he sold sweat socks to schools. But anyhow, that's how the idea went from Dallas up the East Coast, then back into North Central, then came down to Oklahoma.
And I understand it's actually the Depression, 1929 and 1932, that drove some of these plans because people brought in chickens and meat to pay their bills.
In those days, they paid their doctor bills with chickens and pork and a bushel of corn and so on.
In my studies, similar plans actually went back to the 1600s, giving credit to a Montreal physician that far back. But to bring it into modern times, the plan has been out there then for some time, but it wasn't in Oklahoma. So how did it come to Oklahoma?
The Sisters of St. Anthony Hospital in Oklahoma City heard about this prepayment plan idea, and they wanted to set something up in Oklahoma City. The sister who was in charge at that time was Sister Mary Agnes. She went to Philadelphia in Wisconsin and Minnesota and got the idea that that was a pretty good idea. Then they were looking for who would set it up in Oklahoma. The sweat sock salesman applied in a hotel room in Chicago. They liked him. I liked him. He was a likable guy, came to Tulsa. In order to get Tulsa involved, the sisters put the headquarters over here instead of in Oklahoma City.
There seems to be a story that leads up to that. You recall Dr. James Stevenson.
Dr. Jim Stevenson, yes.
A Tulsa doctor, and Dr. Harry Turner led a carload of doctors in 1939 to investigate this thing, prepaid.
Also.
So then they spent about a year or so planning and gathering information.
That's correct.
That was then March 15th of 1940, Group Hospital Services of Oklahoma, the Oklahoma Plan, as it was known then, opened its doors, and it happened to be at 4th and Main in the Tulsa Loan Building.
Yes.
That plan adopted the Blue Cross name and logo.
Blue Shield came along later than the Blue Cross thing.
Yeah. And 45, I think.
Yes, 1945 is 5 years different.
Jump in any time here now, Ron. You don't have to wait till you become president of this.
One of the interesting stories, I think, Ralph alluded to the St. Anthony sisters, and then, there was a guy named Walter McBee that was involved. But he was kind of the first director, and then, as Ralph said, Andy Helen was the first president of the plan. But it was an interesting story they used to tell about how it came about being in Tulsa versus Oklahoma City, because both communities were interested in having a plan of this nature set up. There was a group of businessmen from both communities went down to Dallas and looked at what was going on. They came back and decided that the first group of business guys that could raise the seed money, as they called it, for the plan, that's where the home office would be. You'll remember, John, the old Tulsa Club downtown. It was where the Tulsa contingent met, and they raised their $5,000. They needed $10,000 is what they determined. They raised their $5,000 first, so that's why really the plan was over here in Tulsa.
Isn't that amazing to this day?
Is because they got together down at the Tulsa Club and decided, well, let's do this, and here's $5,000 to fund it. That was really the launching pad for setting it up.
And then interesting that E.K. Gaylord of the Daily Oklahoman was an early investor in this program.
He was.
He was a major opponent of socialized medicine, so he was early in.
Yes.
Yeah, which is interesting when you think about that being in 1939, 1940, and the thought of socialized medicine, and here we are, 2013. Now we're talking about Obamacare being socialized medicine. And in between that is a fascinating history of healthcare and financing of healthcare.
Very much so.
It goes kind of full circle.
Yeah. Then the first account was St. Anthony's Hospital in Oklahoma City.
I think the first one in Tulsa was the Chamber of Commerce.
That's correct.
Where for 75 cents a month or $1 for a family of 4, you were eligible for 30 days of hospitalization.
Yep. If I'm not mistaken, they're still members.
Oh, really?
Yeah. In fact, we offer a program for small business through the Tulsa Chamber. They've been with us all these years.
Interesting, some famous names that were on the board to begin with. T.C. Braniff, president of Braniff Airlines.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Virgil Brown of Coca-Cola Bottling, and became the chair of the board.
Chairman of the board.
Yeah.
That was before my time. I know, looking at me, you might say that was way before your time. Just kidding.
Another name that was involved, which I found really interesting, is my general counsel when I became CEO was a lady named Jackie Haglin. Her husband, Dr. Roger Haglin, was on our board of directors. But her dad was one of the individuals at the Tulsa Club in 1940 that was instrumental in starting the plan. So you leapfrog from 1940 to when she became general counsel in like 1997, 50 years there, and she winds up being a senior officer in the plans.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
The Oklahoma Hospital Association and the Oklahoma State Medical Association both supported the plan, and they promoted it. So then you bring up N.D. Helland. He comes to Tulsa December 5th of 1941. Didn't have insurance experience, did he?
No insurance experience. As I said, he was a sweat sock salesman and used that all the time. He said, now, I may not know all I need to know about hospitals and doctors, but I can sure tell you about sweat socks.
That was his icebreaker, I'm sure, many times.
Oh, many times. He was the one that hired me, so he did have pretty good judgment.
Was he a tall man?
No, he was not a tall man, about my size, which is 5'9", and was quite a guy.
Salesman's personality, obviously.
Yes. Now, the second president, which you'll hear about, is Ralph Bethel. He was the accountant. Now, Walter McBee, he reminds me of a movie star. He had long blonde hair and wore suede shoes. He later became president of the Texas Blue Cross and Blue Shield plan.
I think an analogy with that. The 8th plan president here was a guy named Burt Marshall, who now is the plan president in Texas. If you go back and look at the history books, Walter McBee, who was actually the first senior director, or whatever you want to call him, here in Oklahoma, went to Texas to run the Texas plan in 1941 or 40.
Right.
And now, in the year 2012, Burt Marshall went to Texas from the Oklahoma plan to run the Texas plan. So we've got 2 Oklahoma boys down in Texas running the Texas plan.
Back when Mr. Helland was president, it was a pay-before-you-go plan. It was not considered insurance.
True.
Meaning what? Just explain the difference there.
Well, it was a prepaid health care plan type. You prepaid ahead of time into our fund, and when you needed care, you went to the hospital. And in those days, we didn't even have an identification card. They had to handle everything by phone. It was quite a problem. We later got paper identification cards, then now plastic, of course. It was quite an organization. When I joined the plan, I didn't know what it was because I was fresh out of college. And my father-in-law was the chief of the fire department here in Tulsa, Vern Barton. I married his daughter. So I asked him, what about this prepaid plan downtown? He said, what are you going to do, go to work for him? And I said, yeah. He says, go. And so I went.
Good advice.
Yes. The firemen in Tulsa were very much behind the whole idea.
They said petroleum, aviation industries, farmers were a big block of enrollment back then. You've described what prepaid was. Then what is insurance?
Well, insurance got to be scientific. That's really what it was. If you were just a fund, you paid your money and you drew it out or drew something out. Insurance, you were issued a contract and it became legal. If you paid your money in premiums, you went to the hospital or the doctor, and that was paid for you out of everybody's premiums. It became less of a personal thing and more of a corporate thing.
Okay.
And that's been debated for years, because back then and even today, people really don't consider Blue Cross an insurance company. It's a healthcare financing organization. The argument has been for years, like you can insure a boat or a house, you really can't insure your health. That's been debated for years, and that's why a lot of people say healthcare financing is what we do. We don't really insure anything.
And you would agree.
It's a matter of semantics, and I agree. Yeah.
Right. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor comes along. Ralph, do you remember hearing about it?
Yes. I enlisted in the Air Force. That was before I came to Oklahoma. Right. I got out of the service in 1944. How I got here in Tulsa and met my bride and her father, I was on my way to Colorado, back to where I was born. I was going to enroll in Colorado College, which is a small college about the size of Tulsa University and Oklahoma City University in Colorado Springs. I didn't make it to Colorado Springs that time, but I met a blonde-haired young lady, and that's how I stayed in Tulsa and went to Tulsa University and eventually graduated and got married.
So thank God for blondes, right?
Yes. I haven't left that.
Right. Any comments about how the war years affected Blue Cross and Blue Shield?
We just coasted, really. They didn't have an awful lot of marketing programs as such, because people would hear about us and then they'd make a phone call or request somebody to come out and, what is this prepaid health care plan you're talking about? Andy Helland and Walter McBee even hired school teachers to be their first marketing guys, and that's how we got into the schools in the early days.
Lots of word of mouth then, wasn't it?
Yes.
But there weren't any other entities promoting prepaid at the time. There was no competition at the moment, was there?
No, there was no competition until after the war. Competition started showing up. I came home from Japan after MacArthur took over there, and I was no longer in the Air Force, and I was in the infantry. Those changes happen, kind of like Blue Cross when you're in the battle of getting something started. It was kind of like a battle.
Do you think one of the reasons Blue Cross Blue Shield is such a solid name today is because they had that early start early on, or maybe that washed away as competition came along?
Well, it became a national organization rather speedily. They gave everybody the assignment of coming up with a logo and a slogan. A fellow in Minnesota, Van Steenwyk, was kind of an artist, and he sketched that out on his desk one day and submitted it to the other plans, and they adopted it, and I forget at the moment how it came to be blue.
Seems like I remember that the Red Cross was out with their cross, and I thought maybe they said you can't use our red, and so they said blue. Now, maybe that's an old wives' tale I heard somewhere. If that doesn't connect with you.
That doesn't connect with me at all. You know, the hospitals were known for having a cross. That's part of what Van Steenwyk used as his inspiration, was a Christian cross.
And that changed over time.
Over time to become Blue Cross. We then went through a lot of effort and legal issues to become Blue Cross. We were sponsored at one time by the American Hospital Association. The Hospital Association spread it across the country. Oklahoma was among the first, however, to become a Blue Cross organization.
Some of the cases that they were dealing with, illnesses in the 40s.
Polio was the big one.
Polio came on strong.
Yeah. The guys that came home from World War II were primarily responsible for getting hospitals started and Blue Cross started. because all of us who were in that war had been used to getting top-notch medical care in the service. So the veterans pretty much lobbied Washington to say, we need to have a health care program for our wives and our children. The federal government then, right after World War II, expanded into encouraging it. Then in the late 40s, Harry Truman, was going to have a national health insurance plan. But the reason why they didn't have a national health insurance plan at that time was because the senators all knew that there was a Blue Cross plan in their state, and they used that as a justification for not having a national government program, because let's give them time to see if they can make it work. Sure enough, it did.
Back then, in the 40s and 50s, the proliferation of the blue plans just exploded. At one time, I think there's like 120 different blue plans, either a cross or a shield or a combined cross and shield throughout the United States. So a lot of states had 2 or 3 plans that operated. It was so common that throughout the history of the blues, as we call it, virtually and still today, 1 in 3 Americans carry a blue card. And there's not too many organizations that can say that. In fact, back when I was a kid, I remember people asking, well, who do you have your Blue Cross with? When they were really asking, who do you have your health insurance with? It got to be so prolific that people just looked at Blue Cross as the health insurer, of choice.
And I think that's what I was alluding to earlier. Yeah. That's what gave you your great start.
In fact, they say, and I don't know if this is really true, but we like to brag about it, they've claimed that the Blue Cross and Blue Shield emblem is the second most recognized brand in the world, second to Coca-Cola. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but when you stop and think about 1 in 3 Americans carry that card, that's pretty dynamic.
Interesting, we're talking about illnesses. Back then in the 40s, cancer, only 11 out of 5,000 cases. And look how prevalent cancer is today.
Now.
What are we doing to ourselves?
Well, we're smoking and we're drinking.
And diet.
And we're eating badly. Lots of fat.
By the end of 1944, Oklahoma City actually lagged the rest of the state in memberships. Tulsa was leading in enrollments.
Of course, I wasn't around, but I remember Ralph telling stories. They would go out and blanket the state. In fact, there's a picture in our history book of Ralph with a trailer. That's really how they marketed the plan. They would go into a community, set up shop, and do enrollment meetings there on Main Street, put a banner up on Main Street. I think just the fact that Tulsa was the home office probably led to more enrollment being over here in the northeastern part of the state and then gradually working its way toward the Oklahoma City and the Panhandle area.
And that's because there wasn't any competition. They just assumed this is the way we're going to insure our people, these plans.
Right.
And so you got a lot of free publicity.
Well, a lot of it we generated on our own. But it was free, no question about that. It had to come through the Tulsa Club, is how that all occurred. The guys that put up the money all then enrolled their employees. Tulsa was first, so Oklahoma City was not as homogeneous as Tulsa was in that regard.
You've already addressed this, but the late 40s then was when the plan actually moved into the Akdar Shrine building.
Yes.
I used to work for KRMG.
Right above us.
And I didn't work there then. But they would talk about the live music on the second floor, I believe.
Actually, it was the first floor. We were in the basement, and KRMG was on the first floor.
And they'd have these live Western bands in there, and you could hear that.
We could hear it. My background, however, originally was with KVOO, even before I got involved with KTUL.
At KVOO, what did you do?
I was trying to be an announcer. It wasn't very successful, but that's what I was trying to do.
Were you around any of the Wills and those people?
Well, I spent some time up there. When you're going to school at TU, they send you out into the community, which they did. And we went to KVOO to do back-to-college programs. It was back-to-college programs that I met Ben Henneke, who then became president of Tulsa University.
I interviewed Dr. Henneke. Those listening to this, you'll be able to listen to him elsewhere on this website, who talks very much about back to college. It was his idea, actually, I believe.
Yes, it was his idea. I got acquainted with him in Joplin, Missouri, which is where I went to high school. He came up and did a back to college program up there because I asked a lot of questions of him at that program that they put on for the high school. He made me promise that if I ever got to Tulsa, I'd come by and see him. He was then in charge of the speech and theater department at TU. That's what brought me to Tulsa, was to see Ben Henneke before I went to Colorado. And he says, why don't you just stay right here and go to school at TU? And I did.
Great choices. Great people. Talking about all the free publicity you got, radio and TV, they just came out and promoted that. That'd be something unheard of today, but they did that for sure because they thought, and they were doing a very good thing.
Yes, because the doctors in most of the local communities and the hospitals sponsored Blue Cross and Blue Shield. The doctors asked their pharmacists to cooperate, and the pharmacy cooperated. So we had a built-in group of people that knew about Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and they spread the word.
The Blue Shield plan began as Oklahoma Physician Services, which was a companion then to Blue Cross.
In 1945. That was 5 years later after the Blue Cross plan came along.
The Blue Shield, how did that come about?
That came about because doctors in other parts of the country wanted to have a prepaid health care plan. So the doctors here, primarily in Tulsa, wanted a prepaid medical care plan. That's how come the Blue Shield plan started here in Tulsa with Blue Cross.
In 1954, the Oklahoma Blue Cross plan introduced extended benefits that covered the dread diseases, polio, scarlet fever, rabies, and that type of thing. By the end of that year, almost 250,000 Blue Cross members had enrolled in the extended benefits program. What was this doing to hospitals? Were they having to expand as this was happening?
The thing that the federal government did was, at the urging of the veterans that came back from World War II, the Hill-Burton funding program to build hospitals in communities was started. Incidentally, the first hospital in Oklahoma, first hospital in the country, too, to get Hill-Burton funds to build a hospital was in Nowata, Oklahoma. So the doctors wanted to try out prepaid health care to see if it would work. And there were some forward-looking doctors who got behind it. And that's why Blue Shield came into being. The shield was later based on the American Medical Association symbol.
Rising costs. We're talking about that today. This is when that started becoming an issue.
Yeah, well, John, back on your question about Blue Shield on the physician side, throughout history, if you look on the healthcare dollar, about 60 cents of every dollar usually is accounted for on the hospital side, but there's about 30% on the physician side and then 10% on what we call pharmacy and other medical expense. So that 30% got to starting to be a huge expense for people, and the hospital side was so successful with Cross that the doctor said, well, we need something similar to that because that big portion of the health dollar is getting to be really expensive, and that's what really generated the need for the Blue Shield side. But cost has always been an issue, and the rising cost has always been something that, we've been addressing since day one. Probably always will.
Ground was broken for a new 3-story structure, 40,000 square feet at 12th and Boulder. In fact, they had extra foundations to be poured so that eventually would rise to 12 floors. So that was a big moment in the history of Blue Cross.
We had moved several times from the bank next door to the Bank of Oklahoma downtown to the American Airlines building, which is a parking lot now, then to the Akdar Temple building in the basement. And while we were in that basement, the executives of Bank of Oklahoma said, you're going to have more space here shortly, aren't you? The basement of the Akdar building was getting pretty full. Andy Helen said, why don't we build a building somewhere or buy a building somewhere? Well, the idea of building a building struck a note with people, and our board of directors thought there was a movement of going towards the south end of downtown. But it was the executives of Bank of Oklahoma and the board of directors, doctors and hospital people too, as well as business people, who said, let's see what's going on South Boulder. And that's how we came to be in South Boulder.
At that time, about the only building? I mean, was that considered getting far out?
One of the first, yes. Yeah. It was far out of downtown.
Right.
Well, we were talking about a 3-story building. At that time, the architects said, all you need is a 3-story building. Andy Helland and Ralph Bethel and the rest of us said that someday we're going to grow bigger than that 3-story building. We might just as well prepare. And that's why we had the footings for a 12-story building. The 9 stories were added at a later time.
Were people noticing the growth of Blue Cross and Blue Shield so that they would be seeking you for employment?
Well, it mainly came about because of the computers. They came along, and we employed a large number of ladies who operated keyboards. They knew how to type, and us guys didn't know how to type very well. We hired a number of high school graduates who were expert typists, and they became expert keyboard operators in the computer business.
We were talking about rising costs, but the indigent care was becoming a major concern about this time as well. And I don't know how Blue Cross was addressing that, or hospitals were.
Oklahoma, unfortunately, has always been in one of the top categories for having an uninsured population and an indigent population. In fact, back in the 90s, when the wellness programs and all the stay well programs and things like that were developed and implemented to try to improve the health in the state, it was a well-known fact that Oklahoma was the only state in the union whose health status declined from year to year based on national statistics. So we've had this problem ongoing for a long time. Back in those days, post-trauma syndrome wasn't really known about for all the World War II veterans coming back. But all those guys that came back in the late 40s and 50s and 60s suffered from that tremendously. There's been a lot of discussion about that led to a lot of the indigent, the uninsured population. They didn't know how to handle that type of disease. So you talk about the extended benefits. We really didn't know what that was all about back in those days like we do today. That was really the start of addressing the health status in the state of Oklahoma. And back in those days, being a rural state, too, you didn't have big urban centers that had big facilities to take care of people. They didn't go to the doctor unless they absolutely had to. There's a lot of factors that contributed to that, but that's been a factor that we've been addressing for a long time. At one time, I remember when I first came on board back in the early 80s, Henry Bellman came into the office and asked Ralph, he said, we got to do something. He said, this is such a serious issue. Do something for me. I remember going to meetings with Ralph and Henry Bellman, and he said, can you give me a $20 plan or something that we can sell to people to try to address this problem with the indigent population? And we come up with a program. We jokingly called it El Cheapo back in those days, but we put together really a good benefit plan to take to the market. Bellman got on the radio and TV with Ralph. We promoted this thing through the state. But quite candidly, as the old saying goes, the dogs didn't like the dog food. They wouldn't even buy a $20 product to insure themselves. So finding the magic solution to that is very difficult. And quite candidly, I don't think anyone has yet.
It's being addressed today even.
Yeah.
They don't want to buy insurance. So that meeting with Henry Bellman, it was a good idea. He certainly was sincere, and you embraced it.
Well, I had met Henry because he became active in politics. I thought we ought to be participating in political affairs, too. I went to a precinct meeting with the executive vice president of St. John's Hospital here in Tulsa. Somehow or other, I came out of that meeting elected precinct chairman. It was a railroad job, I think. Then I went looking in Oklahoma City for somebody that we could talk to that had political connections in Oklahoma City. G.T. Blankenship, who was a prominent family in Oklahoma City, at that same time was getting organized, and we had a heck of a time finding the Republican headquarters. It was in an office building, and it didn't have a name on the door. Bellman was doing the same thing. He was back from the war, and he thought that the veterans ought to be a part of political affairs because we needed some things, health care being one of them. So that's how Blankenship and I both met Henry Bellman. He later then became chairman of the Republican Party in Oklahoma, in a state that Republican was not a very popular word.
That's why you couldn't find the Republican, because it was all Democrat. And for those who will be listening for years from now, here we are. It's a very Republican state, obviously, but it started with Henry Bellman, the shift to Republicanism in Oklahoma. He was our first Republican governor, of course.
Right. Very good friend of mine, incidentally, and he did a lot of things for me and my family, so he's a joy.
Well, we always knew him as a matter-of-fact, down-to-earth, don't mess around, straight-shooting kind of guy, and you would probably agree with that.
Oh, I would, 100%. When he ran for the U.S. Senate, I was going to Washington to pay a visit to Washington. He was there at the time. He thought I ought to spend some more time in Washington, and I did spend some time in Washington. But I had to leave Blue Cross in order to do that. But that was part of an experiment. In the process, with G.T. Blankenship and Henry Bellman and myself, they wanted me to get involved as a candidate. Andy Helen was from Wisconsin and Minnesota area. He had been active in politics in that area. So Henry Bellman and a group of the Tulsa Club people thought we would go to the Sunray Oil Company, who were enrolled in Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And they asked Andy Helen then if I could run for the state House of Representatives. We decided that it was a nice experiment to see if a corporate guy could get elected and serve in the Oklahoma legislature. And I served in both the House of Representatives and the Senate in Oklahoma.
While with Blue Cross Blue Shield.
While with Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Mm-hmm. To see if the experiment worked.
And did it?
No.
Why not?
Our fellow employees didn't like for me to be proposing legislation that our customers didn't necessarily agree with.
Okay.
Was the main problem.
So they heard feedback then on that?
Well, they got feedback plenty. Because I was a reformer, and so was Henry Bellman, and so was G.T. Blankenship, and folks like that.
But if this guy who works for Blue Cross is over there in the city proposing these things, then we don't like Blue Cross.
That's the idea. Yeah. That's the thing that occurred, and nobody ever asked me not to run. I just decided that I'd rather have a job at Blue Cross and Blue Shield than to be a politician.
Right. Wise choice.
Yes.
In the 60s, there was the federal entry into the healthcare business, and then that promoted Blue Cross because the choice was Blue Cross, Blue Shield.
Yeah, there were two federal programs in the 60s that really changed the landscape. One was the Federal Employee Program, and the other was Medicare. And that was a springboard for a lot of changes in later years. But the Federal Employee Program was one of the programs that we have always been involved in since day one, and Medicare as well. So those were the two big changes in the 60s that really impacted. And back then, health insurance, as we called it, or Blue Cross, was built around the group model. You'd market to the employers. They would bring their employees in. You'd set it up as a group account. And the Federal Employee Program became the largest group account in existence. And that's significant when you leap forward now to 2000 plus, when the market started shifting away from the group model that Ralph and these guys all put in and Blue Cross was built around, to now a retail market or an individual market. Huge implications. But that was a major, major deal back in the 60s.
Well, it just grew Blue Cross enormously and fast. It must have been difficult to keep up with the growth of it at that point.
It was difficult. But we did in Oklahoma, because of the situation among the farm population and other populations, we had what we called community enrollments. We enrolled groups of people in the community as individuals and made a group out of people in a certain city or county. That's how we expanded in Oklahoma. And a number of states did the same thing, Texas being one of them.
1967, Ralph Bethel assumes the leadership of Blue Cross Blue Shield from Andy Helen.
Well, Ralph Bethel was primarily a finance expert. He handled all the technical part of collecting money, lecturing all the rest of us. You can't spend more than you got. And did a good job of it, incidentally. I explained to you that I went to Washington with Bellman. I was up there I'd had 4 years of Washington, D.C., and I decided, and my wife decided, it was time for me to come back to Oklahoma and she to come back to Oklahoma. I resigned from my job in Washington, got my suitcase unpacked, and on a Saturday morning, I got this telephone call from Ralph Bethel, who said, "Are you about through with all that glamour stuff that you've been doing in Washington?" I said, "Yeah, I'm home." And he says, "I want to see you in my office Monday morning." I said, "What do you got in mind?" He says, "Well, I think you might make a good president someday. Would you come see me Monday morning? We'll talk about it." That's how I got well acquainted with Ralph Bethel.
What was your job in Washington?
In Washington, I was with the Department of Commerce as an economic development specialist.
Did you enjoy that?
Yes, but I'll tell you, Bob Kerr was one of the guys that was really missed in Washington because he was from Oklahoma. He was famous among all the congressmen and senators.
Probably the most powerful senator the state has ever had, Senator Robert Kerr.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was very nice to me, too.
Can you describe him and his personality and how he'd come into a room? And
he dominated a room. When he hit in, everybody turned and paid attention to Bob. John McClellan of Arkansas was one of Bob Kerr's buddies. The Arkansas McClellan-Kerr port out here is a result of those two guys trying to harness the Arkansas River.
August of 1969, construction on the expanded 9-floor addition.
Well, that was Ralph Bethel's doing. Again, the issue was we had outgrown our space in the 3 stories, and we might just as well plan on growing some more. So the 9-story addition was built because we had the beginnings of that already started.
And in that period of time, updated their computer system. IBM 305 RAMEC.
Yes. We were updating computer systems almost every year, and it was hard to find programmers. And the machines got bigger. Now they're smaller. But in those days, the computer machines, just the machines, occupied a whole floor. Then the programming staff got bigger, and we had to provide room for them. Ralph Bethel was responsible for expanding that whole area. Did a good job.
We haven't talked about the number of employees during your time. Do you recall how many employees you would have had?
When I retired, we had 1,200. So we were building all the way from 200 to 1,200 over those 20 years that I was president. But they grew in technology. I think we grew pretty well. IBM was a big help to us, and so was the Arthur Young Company.
73, then the two entities were merged into one corporation, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma. What did that do to the company?
Well, it meant we had to redo all our literature. So the public relations and advertising department grew also.
Before that time, there was actually a Shield organization and a Cross organization, and you would have floors that would be half Shield, half Cross. In fact, when I first went to work there in 1980, up on the 12th floor, which was the executive floor, there was a folding door that would actually divide the 12th floor in half. And I thought, well, I wonder why that's there. And they told me the story that when they'd have a board meeting, they'd pull that door and they'd divide the floor, and the Shield board would meet on one side of the wall, and the Cross board would meet on the other side of the wall. So it was a very split organization, and when they combined, that was a major improvement because they were able to then combine not only facilities but staffs. But it did lead to things like printing ID cards, and everything had to be reissued. The computer systems had to be integrated. I can just imagine that was really a big exercise to go through.
And they weren't competing against each other.
No.
It was just that they had a different product to sell, I guess.
Well, the boards were in the same room. And if they had only Blue Cross business, they'd close the door. The Blue Shield would have a cup of coffee, and it got to be awkward. So we combined them into one. Then we decided that long about there, we ought to do our own print shop. At our location, there was a building that was next door to us. So we set up a print shop. Then we had to worry about paper, and then we had to worry about staff that knew how to set up presses and get into printing.
May 31st, 1977, you succeed Ralph Bethel as President and Chief Executive Officer. Were you ready for the job? Were you nervous?
Well, I came back in 72 to 77, and he was busy training me to become the president. Yes, I was ready for the job.
What challenges did you face then as you took over?
Well, of course, always there's the business of money. Money was the big challenge in those days. I had a lot of experience in the service with mathematics, codes, and that sort of thing, and so I hired the first actuary that the Blue system in Oklahoma had. I stole him from Mass Mutual in Boston.
Tell us what then he brought to the table.
He brought to the table a scientific way of relating illnesses to their cost and setting rates. I remember my first chore back when I joined Blue Cross and Blue Shield in 1950. My first chore was raising the rates from $2.65 a month to $4.65 a month. And everybody asked me, how did you get the $2 increase? Ralph Bethel figured it out on his abacus. Really? That's absolutely correct. That's how we got to that. Well, it stood us in good stead for quite a while, but we needed an actuary back then. We had consulting actuaries, but we wanted one on our own staff that we could work with every month.
In 1982, then, Blue Cross and Blue Shield implements the Staying Well program for its employees. They were stressing the benefit of staying, obviously, physically fit and fitness classes, because you'd want people to be healthy. That was a program that your PR department had to promote?
We had doctors that used to use our offices for part-time practice and come treat our employees. So we decided that we needed a full-time medical director. So we hired a full-time medical director. He got acquainted with our full-time actuary. Then the programs got into quit smoking. I remember going to board meetings. The smoke-filled room. A couple of doctors were sitting next to me one time, and they said, "Don't you wish we could quit this?" I said, "Yeah, I've been smoking ever since I got into the service in World War II. A few guys find out how to tell me how to quit smoking, I'd appreciate it." As it turned out, they didn't find out. I found it out myself because I had a pneumothorax. I busted a lung. I was standing lecturing to some employees. I went cough. I apparently had pneumonia, and it caused blisters, on your lungs, and one of the blisters broke. So that was the beginning of us talking about preventive medicine. How can we prevent people getting sick?
And at the same time, tying back to your comments about cost, the groups at that time started coming forward saying, something has to be done. Cost is out of control. It's getting to be such a big issue on their balance sheet, healthcare cost as a group, that they were asking us, can't we do something? And that's when the smoking cessation programs, diet programs, physical exercise groups would come forward and start paying for gym memberships and all kinds of things that we were trying to improve the health status. Once again, one of the worst in the nation in Oklahoma, and trying to attempt to improve that.
And we're still trying to improve
Still
that.
trying to improve that.
I think we're making some progress, though, because we're talking now about prevention. How can we prevent illness? The anti-smoking business is not making as much progress as it used to, but it ought to be making more. I don't smoke anymore, thank God. Here I am, 86.
Well, it's paid off because you're looking well. And if Ron and I can look like you do at 86, we'll be very pleased.
Well, I quit drinking, too.
Yeah? Well, so did I.
At the same time. So.
One of the dynamics on the wellness side that I always found interesting, and looking back on it, I didn't really realize what we were doing, but when you leapfrog to the late 80s and early 90s, we realized that, the World War II generation, you're not going to change their behavior and their habits. So let's focus on the young people. In fact, Ralph, I think, was one of the first guys as CEO of a Blue Plan to come forward in the early 90s and set up programs to start addressing how can we get into the schools, how can we start teaching young people wellness to try to improve this, knowing it's not going to happen short term, but long term it's going to be some benefits there. We kind of went full circle with trying to address existing chronic illnesses, then trying to implement wellness programs, not just within groups, but into schools and into the young people. And we're very active in that today, the plan is, through the Caring Foundation for Kids.
And then there was a feasibility study for life insurance that would come along. And the gentleman sitting right across from me here, Ron King, you were right in the middle of all that.
I was. Actually, when Ralph hired me in 1980, there was an individual named Rick McCutcheon that worked for Ralph. And when Ralph came up with the idea to come up with a life insurance company, they actually set a company up with a blank tablet. He wanted to start from scratch. He said, I want to do this right from the ground up and build it brick by brick. And Rick was the guy that actually Ralph put in charge. And then when he hired me in 1980, I only lasted about 6 months in my job. And Ralph walked into my office, and I'll never forget it, on a Friday afternoon. He said, Monday, I want you to go head up the life company. I didn't have any more idea than a rabbit of how to run a life insurance company. But that's what Ralph wanted. He wanted somebody to go in, take this, and build it and learn, as you do that. You ask Ralph about Ralph Bethel training him. That was the real start of Ralph's succession program with his senior guys. He had a rotation program. My first job in his rotation plan was running a member service life insurance company.
I think we operated in the same building at the same time because you were in Liberty Towers.
Well, we actually were out on Broken Arrow Expressway in the Midway building just for a short time, and then we moved to Liberty Towers, and that's where your offices were.
And we were on the 23rd floor. So this began in a small apartment that really...
2 apartments. We used bathtubs for file cabinets.
That's right.
We had people sitting in the kitchen using the counter for a desk. So it was really...
They had their own refrigerator.
It was a startup, ground-up operation. That's how we built the company.
But wasn't there a call for one plan or one company to offer life? Because I think Blue Cross lost the CE NATCO account because of that. They said, well, we want to deal with one company. And so there was reason to begin to look at life insurance.
That was really the initial start of what we call bundling. You hear bundling a lot today. Well, back then, the groups were saying, can't we write one check for health and life? That really started the process. Really, the life insurance side was a key piece, but an equally large piece of that was the disability coverage. Short-term and long-term disability started coming into play back in the 70s and 80s, and we had some very aggressive disability programs tied in with the life company.
So as you said earlier, you didn't really know much about this. You were on a real learning curve then, weren't you?
Real learning curve.
Who were you learning from? Who were you reaching out to?
There was an organization here in Tulsa called Southwest Insurance Organization. A lot of life people belong to that, so we started networking with them. There were probably a half a dozen blue plans that started at about the same time, and we had a life organization. We'd all get together and meet, exchange ideas and products. But it was really just osmosis. We'd try to copy what we'd see in the marketplace. We'd sit down with groups. What do you want? National organization, Lincoln National Life, was a huge help to us. When I first went to work there as part of the planning operation, Ralph was really engaged at that point with an organization in Colorado, Rocky Mountain Life, who had started a program just previous to us starting ours. I remember the guy running Rocky Mountain Life telling a story of how Ralph got on an airplane one week and came out there and come back with a briefcase full of contracts and policies. And then he come back and said, here, I want you to take these and develop these for Oklahoma. That was kind of our placard for developing programs and products. So the Colorado Blues and Oklahoma Blues worked hand in hand for years on life products. That was a big help.
And you saw this fine young man doing a good job, didn't you?
Yes, I did find that out. He did a good job. He's done a good job all the way through his career here.
Well, thank you, sir. That means a lot. Some days I wondered.
I'm sure. There was a move then to HMOs, Health Maintenance Organization.
Contract medicine.
Yeah.
Oh, mercy.
Why do you say it that way?
When HMOs and PPOs first came about back in the 80s, that was just almost communism. And the hospitals at that time really resisted because what came with that was price controls. with the hospitals. Back when Medicare came about, there were any number of cost control measures implemented after Medicare trying to retain cost. And one of those was called DRGs, diagnostic related groupings. And when we did contract medicine, we incorporated in the HMO and PPO contracts with physicians and hospitals price controls and price groupings. For us to come forward as an insurance company or a financier to tell the hospitals and doctors, here's what we're going to pay you, instead of them dictating to us what they were going to charge, it created some interesting meetings.
That we can't go into right here?
No, we can't. In fact, we wanted to do an HMO and a PPO, but Ralph made a decision, I don't want to be the first in the marketplace, which looking back was a very wise decision. So we let Prudential come into the marketplace and watch them get beat up royally by the hospitals and the docs and the media, because nobody really understood what this was all about. But shortly after that, we decided we need to enter into the PPO, the managed care realm, as they called it. Ralph called myself and another individual, Jack Walker, who was another senior officer, into his office and said, Jack, you're going to do the HMO, and Ron, you're going to do the PPO. So go figure out how we do this. We started going out and holding meetings, and Ralph told me on the PPO, he said, two things are a must. We got to have St. Francis, and we got to have St. John's. St. John's being closer to downtown, that was my first stop. He said, you need to go talk to St. John's. I went into the meeting, and at that time, Sister Therese Gottschalk was the CEO, who I learned to respect and admire tremendously over the years. For those that know Sister Therese, she was about maybe 4'10", but carried a big stick and ran a good hospital. And I went over for the meeting, and she was sitting at the head of the table with her staff around the table, and I come in, started my presentation, and got into about 10 minutes of my presentation, and she just interrupted me and said, Mr. King, and wiggled her finger at me to come out into the hall. So I got up from the table, went out in the hall, and she let me know in certain terms that the meeting was over, that they were not going to be a player in anything like a PPO. Now, shortly after that, we did manage to get them into our network, and we're glad to have them. But we were thrown out of several doctors' offices and several hospitals in those days. They were always polite, but it was a tough sell. But
you could probably understand why they were bucking it.
Yep.
So then St. Francis, was that a lot easier to bring them in?
Not really. In fact, what was really interesting with St. Francis, the Blue Board was dictated in those days by a set of statutes in Oklahoma. As a not-for-profit mutual organization, which is kind of an animal of its own, we had a set of bylaws and statutes that dictated we had 2 hospitals and 4 physicians and then 9 laymen on the board. So part of the CEO's job, back in those days, Ralph's job, was to make sure we had good quality board representation. So recruiting doctors to the board and recruiting hospitals to the board was a very important piece of the job. And at that time, Ralph had recruited the head of St. Francis, a guy named Lloyd Verrett, was on our board. So it was really an interesting dynamic to sit in a board meeting and hear the discussion about, well, what are these PPOs we read about? Are we going to do one of those? The board asking Ralph and staff. So as we started studying this and implementing it, Lloyd was really kind of in the middle of everything, trying to figure out which direction he was going to take the hospital, and then at the same time, he was over here on the Blue Cross board. And he was having fun with it. He was quite a character. He was from Louisiana, called himself a raging Cajun. He was an interesting guy, very smart, ran a good ship. When it got down to the final decision-making, it got down between Ralph and Lloyd about how we're going to make this thing work between St. Francis and Blue Cross, and they were able to come to an agreement, one that we could live with. It really had some board intervention at that point.
But the agreements were the same between hospitals, whatever you did, right?
Yep, sure.
Then other hospitals at the time, Hillcrest, would they have to come on?
Hillcrest. But in the marketplace then, especially, it's St. John and St. Francis. They were kind of the hospital of choice, as one way of putting it. They were the big hospitals. The groups migrated more towards St. Francis and St. John as far as group enrollments. Not that Hillcrest wasn't important, because they were, but Hillcrest in those days especially were really looked at as the indigent hospital. And then the big hospitals in Oklahoma City, were the St. Anthony's and the Baptist. We did Tulsa first, then we migrated over to Oklahoma City area.
For those who are interested in reading about a study of it, they should do that. But would you assess now, as you look back on HMOs and these programs, is it working the way you saw it, and is it as effective?
On the HMO piece, the model that was built under is, they call it capitation, to where we would cap a payment to a physician, for example, and say, we're going to pay you X amount to take care of this individual or group of individuals. Looking back on that, I think it was very successful. It introduced some price controls, and it got the doctors and the hospitals thinking about how can we better manage providers delivering health care. How can we provide health care for this dollar instead of it just being a free market and kind of a blank check type medicine. So, I think it was very successful.
In 86, Blue Cross Blue Shield began a brand-building advertising program based on the 84 Blue Cross Blue Shield Association Carry the Caring Card campaign. Why was that important? Why did we have to carry the card?
Well, people were beginning to steal our cross and shield.
Oh, really?
Yes. So we embarked on a nationwide program to protect the cross and shield.
From some other blue plans, no less.
Yes.
Unbranded competition, as we called it.
How would that benefit them?
They'd use our cross and shield and our reputation in order to cut in on our market.
A good example is, in the 80s, we started seeing some fragmentation of the blue system. Fragmentation meaning plans competing within a state, because we all have a license area that we are licensed to sell in. Fortunately for Oklahoma, we own the license in all of Oklahoma, but some states, like California, would have a shield plan licensed in Southern California and a cross plan up in Northern California, and they got to competing, but they couldn't use the cross and shield. So what they did, they would come out with what they called a non-branded product. They would go into a market. Unicare, for example, was a name that they used. We had Unicare come into Oklahoma. Well, Unicare was owned by WellPoint, which was a blue licensee. Well, they'd come into Oklahoma marketing Unicare, and they'd go into a group meeting, and they'd say, we have a program, we have a network, we have a product that's very competitive in the marketplace, and it's called Unicare. Well, who's Unicare? Well, we can't really say, but it's really Blue Cross and Blue Shield of California. And that's what the brokers were selling. Oh. If you buy this, you're really getting Blue Cross value, you're really getting Blue Cross service, it's just called something different. And that's when the concept came up of Carry the Caring Card. And I know Ralph spent tons of time in Chicago in national boards meetings trying to figure out how can we not go from state to state, but how can we have a blue card that's carried from state to state to state so people can get their health care through Blue Cross and Blue Shield. If they got an Oklahoma Blue Cross card, they can go to Texas or New York and carry the Caring Card and it be recognized as Blue Cross and Blue Shield as one. And that's how that concept came about.
Interesting. By the middle of the decade, in 85, the plan employed 699 employees, had outgrown its 12-story building, and over Labor Day weekend in 85, about 110 employees moved to the Texaco building at 15th and Boulder. So you're spreading out.
Well, not just the Texaco building. We had another group that we bought a small building for that moved into the one just this side of Texaco, Kewanee Oil. We were growing so much and having to find space for the people that we had to start looking for where could we put people. We expanded into the Texaco building, Kewanee Oil Company building, and then later we bought the building that you're in right now.
But that wasn't the big change for me. In 1986, Ralph came in my office one afternoon and said, I've decided we're not prominent enough in Oklahoma City. We've got to do something in Oklahoma City. How would you like to live in Oklahoma City? I said, well, I don't know. I said, I've never thought about that. But anyway, we bought a building in Oklahoma City, which was the old Leeway Motor Freight building out on Hefner Parkway. Ralph moved me and my family to Oklahoma City, and I was the lone first occupant in a 4-story building for about 3 months. I sat in that building and started recruiting staff. That's how we built the Oklahoma City office, and we filled the building up eventually. We hired our own marketing team for Oklahoma City. We weren't competing, we were just expanding our markets. Had a full staff over there eventually of people in Oklahoma City, and that became a very important office for the growth of the plans. We were growing over here, but something had to happen in the western part of the state.
So that grew fast, probably, since you hadn't been over there.
Yeah.
It did.
Initially, we hired about 100 employees over there. We had a little marketing office over there for years, over on Classen. Our lobbyist was there, and we had some marketing people over there, but we really expanded the operations over there. In fact, we set up the property and casualty company in that office and did a lot of things different just to expand our presence in Oklahoma.
How long were you there?
I came back here in 90, so I was over there about four and a half years.
Did Ralph come over to your office over there?
Ralph actually had an office over there as well, and he spent a lot of time there. He'd come over there 1 week and spend a couple of days, and then I'd be over here the next week for a couple of days. So we burned up a lot of turnpike hours, a lot of time.
1995, the Oklahoma Caring Foundation was added to the family of campuses. This was for children, caring program for children.
Right. Actually, the initial concept, we became intrigued with the program, I think up in Kansas, if I remember.
Yes.
They had set up a program that had a mobile screening van that they would take out into the state and actually screen people for blood pressure, diabetes, vision testing as part of the wellness initiative, trying to constantly think of new ideas to improve wellness in the state. At that time, we got to the point where we probably controlled 25% of the market, and it was important that we took a leadership role in trying to do something so that the public would see Blue Cross out here trying to improve the health status in the state, and that was our first real initiative. So we set up a joint venture with the Tulsa Lions Clubs, actually, and we went out and bought a huge semi-trailer, tractor-trailer rig, and had it outfitted for mobile health screening and did a joint venture with the Lions Club. They drove it all over the state promoting wellness, doing screenings in different communities, and it was a way for us to broaden our presence as well. That was the real start of the foundation, the Caring Foundation. That went on for several years. In the course of that, Ralph announced his retirement in 95, and I became plan president. I'll always remember one of the things he asked me to do when I became CEO in 97. He said, we need to grow that foundation. And, we need to do some things different because what we were doing was making a little bit of an impact, but not near the impact that we had hoped for. And that's when we really started focusing on, and we come up with the idea of expanding not only the big tractor-trailer rig, but having immunization programs for kids, getting back to realizing that we really need to start focusing on the young people. And that's when we started developing these immunization vans to go throughout the state and give immunizations to children. So that was all part of that Caring Foundation.
Which is your baby, isn't it? You
Yes.
really started that.
The Caring Foundation, as it was initially set up, was to address a mobile screening unit, and we soon realized that we really needed to reach deeper into the marketplace and try to bring a higher level of health care to the population. And the way we decided to do that was to address children, and primarily indigent children was our initial target. So we set about to develop a program recognizing that the only way it would really be successful is if we could get the endorsement of some critical partners in the state, one being the State Medical Society, Oklahoma State Medical Association, the Oklahoma Hospital Association. So we went out and we recruited these partners to partner with us, not so much from a financial point of view, but just to have their endorsement, to go out and promote trying to improve the health status of the children in the state of Oklahoma. The Osteopathic Association was a key member. The Oklahoma Department of Health was a key partner. Once we got those endorsements, the first thing we did was we thought, well, we're going to work on immunizations because the physicians were telling us, it's really critical in the life of a person at those first formative years that the immunizations are a real problem in Oklahoma. So we went about and set out with a van. We bought a van. It cost us about $100,000 to equip that van. We had nurses in the van, and they would go out to schools, and they would go out to daycare centers. It took us a while to work through the legality of it as far as liability and all that, but once we got everything kind of figured out, it just started snowballing, and people were calling us saying, can you come to our school? Can you come to our daycare center? We soon needed a second van, so now we're up to 5, I think. We now got 5 vans going throughout the state of Oklahoma, immunizing children. We just recently gave our 200,000th shot and have immunized now over 100,000 children, basically between the ages of 0 and 5 in Oklahoma through these carrying vans. And it could use more, and we plan to have more.
So one child then could get several inoculations.
Yeah, several inoculations.
Whatever childhood diseases is what we're talking about.
You know, your 1-year-old shots, your 2-year-old shots that the babies basically get through their doctors. A lot of people don't have the means to do that, and especially if they're uninsured, they won't take their kids. We just felt like that we needed to do something to improve that statistic.
How did that actually work? Was there a form a child or a parent had to fill out? And then
we have to have the parents' consent. And, you know, that was a little bit of a struggle at the start. But now the schools are so good about getting the medical records and the parents' consent through the schools when the kids enroll that we usually just go through the school to get that. It's worked very well.
Is it known as the Blue Cross Oklahoma Caring Foundation when the van comes out? It is branded that way, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Caring Program for Kids is what we call it.
Since 1999, 100,000 children have received 200,000 immunizations aboard the carrying vans. You just can't imagine if all these children were not vaccinated, or half of them weren't even vaccinated.
It gives the kids a chance. I mean, it gives them a chance for a early childhood. I wish we had a better way of tracking each of those kids throughout their formative years to see, you know, what diseases, if any, they contract, and maybe we can do something different, but we're not quite there yet. We hope to get there at some point. But we're convinced, and the physicians tell us, that this makes a dramatic impact on a kid's life, especially in the early years.
Yeah.
This has been a really successful program, not so much for Blue Cross, but for the state of Oklahoma, and the fact that when you look at the health ratings now and the health statistics in Oklahoma, we're no longer the 49th or 50th state in health status, especially on immunizations. We've moved down to like 38th or 37th or something in the nation. So we're inching our way up, but that's a dramatic jump just in the past 5 or 6 years. And I personally think it's not anything I did, but it's what this program and the people that run these vans and our partners have done for the state of Oklahoma. You know, we kind of celebrate once a year with the Champions of Health big dinner. We'll have 700-800 people show up for this thing, and we recognize people that have helped not only promote the vans, but of doing their own wellness programs in the state of Oklahoma. And it was something to try to promote and recognize the good stuff. Personally, as CEO, when I was CEO, I got so tired of hearing the negative about indigent, uninsured, low health ratings, the health status in the state decreasing. And I finally just told staff, just recognize some good things that are happening, because there's some good things going on. And that's what the Champions of Health as part of this program is all about, and this is a part of that. So we're very proud of this. Naturally, we wish we could do more, and we will as time goes on. Other states are looking at copying this, so it's become pretty well known throughout the Blues and the other states.
Now, in this year, 2013, a pilot program was launched, and the program helps build a baseline for the state assessment of childhood obesity, which is such a big conversation today.
It is, and we're engaged in working with them as far as the childhood obesity. Childhood diabetes is just rampant. When you look at what's happening in the schools now, they're trying to improve their diet, trying to replace the soda, pop, and all the things that these kids are drinking. So it's a concerted effort with several publics in the state, but we're very engaged in that, trying to get this turned around, because they're telling us this is going to be a major, major issue. If we don't get this thing turned around in their childhood, then as adults, the early onset of diabetes is going to have a tremendous health impact.
The Oklahoma Carrying Foundation operates 5 carrying vans now, 2 of which are based in Tulsa, 2 in Oklahoma City, 1 operated by the Choctaw Nation Health Services and based in southeast Oklahoma.
Everyone knows the state of Oklahoma has several Indian tribes with the Indian Health Service. We're working with Indian Health Service, trying to get into the tribes. We'd like to be able to put a van with some of the other major tribes with their health programs, and we're working toward doing that.
This is a nonprofit organization. But all these immunizations, where is the money coming from?
Blue Cross basically funds that, in addition to having our own fundraisers. We have fundraisers throughout the year, contributions, grants. We have a grant writing team. They'll go out and write a grant, and we'll get grants from various entities to support this. Blue Cross provides all the administrative costs and everything as an in-kind contribution. The Champions of Health program is an offshoot of this, and once again, like I said, it was an attempt to recognize the good things that are happening in healthcare through the hospitals, through the different agencies. We have one event a year. We bring in speakers. Last year we had Magic Johnson come in and talk about health-related issues. We had Laura Bush come in the year before So we bring in some prominent speakers to address healthcare issues, but at the same time we recognize, along with our partners, all the good programs in the state that are doing things like wellness programs, programs for the aging, the caring for the kids. And there's any number of programs in the state that we recognize, and they can submit names. I don't know, we have like maybe 200 people submit recommendations, and we give like 7 awards a year. We give them a cash award for their program, as well as recognition for that program. And it's like I say, just something to focus on the good things that are going on and trying to get people to focus on improving wellness and these programs and things throughout the state.
It's almost like now, if you're not doing anything for yourself, it's not because you weren't informed or educated. The country and the state and our city is talking about it so much.
Yeah.
How can you not hear it?
And the resources are there, and that's the attempt of this program, is to put resources out there that people can take advantage of. And quite candidly, why some people don't take advantage of it, it's hard to understand. That's why we want to be proactive in this and trying to promote it. So we've done any number of programs to try to address this.
It's just the national conversation now.
Yeah.
It must have made you feel good to know that you were helping people, and it wasn't all about money here. I mean, you were affecting people's lives.
It did. And you have to understand that people don't understand. We are a mutual, not-for-profit organization. Technically, what that means from a legal aspect is our members are the owners of this company. We don't have stockholders or shareholders. And we would tell people, as president, I'm no more an owner of this company than you are. Every member is an owner of this organization as a mutual company. And
mutual companies in America.
So our dollars don't go back to stockholders, they go to you. And that's why we need to reinvest your premium dollars back to improving your health and providing as much health care for you as we can for your premium dollar. About 9 cents of every dollar goes to administration, but about 90 to 91 cents of every dollar goes back to that member and their health care. And that's why it's incumbent on Blue Cross, and this is what we really believe in, that we promote as much health and wellness for our owners, the members, as we can, and return every penny we can to them because they are the owner of this company.
So on January 3rd, 1997, when you passed the baton to Ron, was this with a great sigh of relief? Were you happy? Here it is. I'm out of here. What were your feelings at the time?
Oh, well, I signed on for 5 more years before that. I could have retired at 65, and I stayed to 70. I love this organization. I love the people. I hopefully did a bunch to build it to the size it is today.
I would wholeheartedly support that, and he did. In fact, I mentioned his succession plan was an interesting program, and I got asked about it throughout my career because it became very well known in the Blue community. Ralph had 4 senior guys at that time, the senior vice presidents, and he literally would walk into your office on a Friday afternoon and he'd say, Monday morning you're going to be the chief financial officer. And myself, as an example, I'm a marketing major. I'm not a CPA. He would come in and say, Monday, you're going to be CFO. And I mean, that was it. Monday morning, you were the CFO of a $1 billion corporation. And it was really an interesting concept from the fact that by the time it was over and done with Ralph's retirement, I was very fortunate in that I literally sat in every chair in the organization. I was CFO, I was chief marketing guy, I was chief operations guy. I got to sit in all those chairs and run those divisions. It was a great learning experience. But at the same time, what we realized later was Ralph was giving the board a choice of 4 people that really knew how this organization was run. I don't know if he'd admit it or not, but that was part of the 5-year extension. He wasn't through with his rotation plan. And he wanted to make sure that he had the 4 guys through the rotation so that he could walk away and hand the board somebody that was really qualified from an experience point of view anyway to run the company.
How long were you in each position as you rotated?
It depended. Usually about 2 to 3.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Looking back on that, I often tell people...
We shot for 3. 3 was the magic.
You'd go in as CFO, for example. Well, you'd have to bring all your staff in, and they all knew he didn't know come here from Sikkim about being a CFO. In fact, Ralph always had a saying, I'll give you a year to learn and a year to perform. And that was kind of how he ran the rotation. And it pretty much happened that way. It took us about a year to really get comfortable with knowing things, but as that rotation and management succession happened, we got, of course, to watching one another and working with one another because we knew my next stop's going to be your seat. So I'd learn as much as I can working with staff and staff meetings and things about what was going on. It took about 12 to 15 years to really get through that rotation plan.
Wow. Where'd you come up with that idea?
I borrowed that from General Electric.
Really?
Yes.
It really, at times, got a little bit humorous. At times, it got a lot frustrating because people would realize, people being staff members, managers, vice presidents, that I could work with this guy next rotation. So everybody was a little bit standoffish sometimes and real careful not to burn bridges with people. It created a very interesting atmosphere.
He sits here, he's got a very nice smile. And he
got a kick out of it. I mean, he wasn't stern. He'd come in with a big old grin on his face, and you knew it was time. I mean, and we got to where we could pretty much gauge, well, it's about time. It seemed like it was always on a Friday afternoon because he'd come waltzing in, and he'd have that kind of smirk on his face and say, Monday. And it was that quick.
Did you emulate somebody as a leader in another company, or did you draw from other people that might have influenced you?
I was a student of General Electric. That's where I borrowed that whole idea from. But I studied a lot of companies, not just General Electric.
A little bit about the future here. Right now, currently, in 2013, we have the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, as it's been called. Using the president's own words, he says today 105 million people have seen a lifetime cap on their coverage lifted, so your patients no longer face the tragedy of approaching a lifetime limit in the middle of a round of chemotherapy. What is your assessment of the Affordable Care Act? Is it something that should definitely be implemented at all levels? Is that a loaded question?
No, it's not. There's so much unknown at this point because of the fact that the regulations for the Act have not even been really written, let alone passed. So there's so much unknown with that. But what we have seen is a major shift away, as I said earlier, from the group market to an individual market, which is a huge change in the insurance world. One of the factors that led to our merger in 2005 with the Illinois, Texas, and New Mexico plants. Oklahoma merger. Massive dollars. But to be able to manage that environment and to set up the programs that they're talking about is going to be a major landscape change. But I have said for years, I'm still 100% convinced of this. I've always believed that somewhere in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., there's a little red brick building. And in that red brick building, there is a diagram on a wall of how we get to socialized medicine. And this is a huge step toward that. This is the first step, I think, toward really going to socialized medicine. And one of the factors key to that is what we've talked about with the Federal Employee Program. When you look at the fact that the Federal Employee Program is now the largest group program in the United States, it would be really easy for the federal government to come in and say, well, we'll just use that as a model and we'll start folding people into the Federal Employee Program and you're in socialized medicine. Now, saying that, when will that happen? Who knows? It could be 50 years from now. But that's where I see this headed. This is just one step toward a single-payer, socialized type medicine with the government in control of that. Now, will there be a role for the blue plans? You bet. I think there always will be. And that's why this shift in the marketplace is really critical right now and why so many of the blue plans are looking at merger into one bigger plan. In fact, if you look at the Blue system, when I came on board in 1980, there was 117 Blue Cross Blue Shield licensees. Today, there's 38. So the consolidation is rampant, and they're doing that so they'll have the infrastructure with which to go out here and address this bigger marketplace. So I think from some aspects, it's brought some good things to the table. When you look at being able to cross state lines and portability, it's going to bring some things to the table with automating medical records and things of that nature that needs to happen. So there's some good things to it. But we really, I don't think, understand the real impact this is going to have.
E.K. Gaylord was spinning in his grave when you were just talking
yes,
about socialized.
Yes, he was.
Finally, then, capturing a point in time, because generations will listen back here, we have a special report from Time magazine, and it's why medical bills are killing us. It's the first time the magazine has devoted one topic to their entire magazine.
Well, John, there's a really interesting phenomenon in the health business. I used to have a little presentation I would give on health economics. I tell people you can forget everything you were taught in school on economics on supply and demand when you look at healthcare. Because in the real world, when there's a demand for something, somebody creates a business or a product to address that. In the health industry, it's just the opposite. The supply being drugs, specialty hospitals, doctor groups, doctor organizations, doctor-owned hospitals, the supply of medical care creates the demand. It's a vicious appetite because they got to fill the beds, they got to use up the drugs that they develop, and they create an appetite that's unknown anywhere else in the world. That appetite is huge, and that demand is growing, and that's what drives the cost of this, and that's what makes this such a difficult issue.
One point here, they say, what makes healthcare so expensive? Average drug prices are sky high. The price of one Lipitor pill in the U.S. is the same as that of 3 in Argentina. One Plavix pill in the U.S. is the same as that of 4 in Spain.
You know what the most frequent prescribed drug is in Oklahoma now?
What?
Antidepressant. That's just an example.
Yeah.
20 years ago, who ever heard of an antidepressant drug?
Right. I want to thank both you gentlemen, and it was such an honor to have both of you here at the table at the same time. Ralph, what was Ron's best features? What was his best leadership qualities?
Want me to leave the room?
Well, one of the things that I look for from all of these guys, if they would do what they say they will do. He always did.
All right. And so, Ron, to Ralph.
Ralph was a great mentor. He was the type of guy that would give you an assignment, and he'd give you enough rope to hang yourself, but he'd also give you the resources that you needed to do a good job. And he was a great listener.
Very good. We've listened with enjoyment, and it's been very, very interesting to listen. And now generations will hear how this all came about and hear the voices of you two great leaders. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.